Coming up on the show today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into some of the world's most ghastly, ghostly ghost towns. And then we're going to take a look into some of the world's most creepiest abandoned places. And then we got some of the world's most haunted and scariest places for you as well. Today, it's October 15th, 2024, and the show is coming at you right now. How's it going, guys? It's been a while since we've been on here for a podcast. Welcome back to the Dark Forest. Tonight, we're gonna be brave. We're gonna dare. We're gonna go past the signs. I hope you're ready to enter the Dark Forest with me. Here we go. Starting off tonight, we're gonna be talking about some of the most ghastly ghost towns that are creepy, scary, and if you know, haunted from around the world. Let's dive! Starting off in Kennecott, Copper Mine, Alaska, is the ghostly glacier. I've got a mountain of copper up here, one prospector wrote in 1900, describing the eastern edge of the Kennecott Glacier in Alaska's remote Valdez-Cordova area. There's so much of the stuff sticking out of the ground that it looks like a green sheep pasture and island when the sun is shining at its best. His excitement was well placed beginning in the late 1800s. Increasing use of electricity, telephones, and automobiles led to greater demand for copper wiring, meaning that a potential fortune was buried in these hills. In 1911, a wealthy industrialist, J.P. Morgan, helped finance a railroad to transport the copper from the site. Kennecott Copper Corporation, comprised of 5 mines and a mill town, became fully operational. Due to a clerical mistake, the spelling of the site's name differs from the glacier's. At the height of the operation, about 600 miners worked long, back-breaking, 7-hour days for $4 or $5 a shift, 7 days a week, ultimately delivering an estimated $200 million worth of copper. But prices would plunge during the Depression, and by the late 1920s, Kennecott's mountain of copper was running out. The last train left the station in November of 1938 until the site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1978, it later became a National Historic Landmark. The tangle of tumble-down buildings was a ghost town according to legend. Attempts to revitalize the area were reportedly sabotaged by the spirits of dead miners who could be heard wailing in the tundra, among the ice falls, and along the trestle bridges that they died on while building them. The next one is the Dead Zone in Chernobyl, Ukraine. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Came the warning over Soviet TV fully 2 days after the Ukraine site's reactor 4 exploded in the early morning hours of April 26, 1986. Caused by flawed design and worker incompetence, the world's worst nuclear disaster released 400 times the radiation of the Hiroshima bomb into the atmosphere, leading to the deaths of 31 people in less than 3 months. Many more died later, often because of Soviet secrecy. The day after the accident, for instance, the nearly 49,000 residents of nearby Pripyat, a community designed to house the plant's workers, were told that the smoke they could see in the sky was merely steam discharge. So they went about their business until, of course, they started getting sick. More than 3 decades later, Pripyat remains a ghost town dominated by the ruins of an amusement park that never opened. Though it's one of the most radioactively contaminated areas in the world, the 1,600 square mile exclusion zone around the disaster site has become an unlikely tourist destination. You'll even find a single small hotel in the remains of Pripyat though its bread is dry and old. The area has also become an unlikely wildlife sanctuary, with boars and foxes moving into a world that for humans at least remains forever frozen in April of 1986. The next one is in Bodie, California, the West's wildest spot. A strange, mysterious country is how 1913's California Tourist Guide and Handbook described the area around Bodie, California. Then a declining mining town where you could stay. The book noted that the stay at the Occidental Hotel was $2 a night, or at the United States Hotel for $1 a night. Presumably, the former had turned down service. Founded after 4 prospectors discovered gold nearby around Mono Lake in 1859, Bodie was nothing but a humble mining camp until 1875, when a mine collapse revealed a rich vein of ore attracting San Francisco speculators. Soon the once secluded spot was filled with more prostitutes, dance halls, and thieves than any other Wild West outpost. There are at least 60 saloons in the place and not a single church. One San Francisco paper carped in 1879 that violence was so common that locals would ask, "Have a man for breakfast?" meaning, was anyone murdered the night before? The first signs of decline appeared in the early 1880s when ore supplies dwindled as costs began to rise. In 1962, after years of neglect, Bodie became the country's best preserved ghost town when the state of California took over its management, leading to its designation as a National Historic Landmark and State Historic Park, though only about 5% of its original structures remain. They're still stocked with bottles, pianos, slot machines, pool tables, stagecoaches, and even coffins. Wow. The next one, we're taking a trip all the way to Vietnam as we visit the Dragon's Lair. No one comes here by accident. The abandoned water park outside the city of Hue in central Vietnam is not in any guidebook, nor is it on any map. For a long time, the site was a well-kept secret among backpackers in Southeast Asia who shared directions scrawled on napkins or by word of mouth. But even if you know how to get there, the roads are rough, and few locals can correct your course, so good luck if you get lost. The history of Ho Tai Tin, the name means Daffodil Lake, is something of a mystery too. Opened in 2004 at a reported cost of $3 million. It struggled financially until it was abandoned to the jungle a few years later. Now the site's centerpiece, an enormous dragon, sits atop a moldering aquarium that rises from the lake. Foliage is overtaking the algae-covered lake. Water slides, under which crocodiles were cruelly left behind in cages, kept alive only because locals fed them live chickens. As a destination for urban explorers, it is allegedly more popular now than it was when it was open. Visitors can explore empty passageways and climb into the Dragon's Maw to gaze out over the lake through graffiti-covered veins. My adrenaline was flowing the whole time, one traveler told the press, which helped put the site on the map. Well, sort of. In a 2016 story, in the end, a visit to the amusement park can feel sad as well as scary, though the crocodiles were reportedly saved by animal activists who moved them to a wildlife park in northern Vietnam. The next one is in Glen Rio, Texas, and New Mexico. Route 66 ruins. For 6 decades, Route 66, the iconic 2-lane highway that cut across the country from Chicago to Los Angeles, was the path of westward promise for such travelers as On the Road author Jack Kerouac and Okies fleeing the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. But when increased auto traffic led to the creation of Interstate 40 decades later, the towns that had flourished along the fabled road fell into decline. Among them, Glen Rio, which had straddled the Texas and New Mexico border for almost 8 decades. The town had its humble beginnings in 1905 when farmers began settling in the area's high plains. A year later, the Chicago Rock Island and Gulf Railway line established a local whistle stop that led to the building of a post office, a hotel, grocery stores, a gas station, and cafes. With the creation of Route 66 in 1926, a tourist welcome station was opened, offering water for overheated radiators even as the town itself became a neon oasis for tile travelers. 17 of Glen Rio's old buildings still stand today, including the State Line Bar, an art modern style Texaco filling station, the Little Juarez Cafe, and the so-called First and Last Motel. If you wander down Glen Rio's dusty Main Street, you will find the remains of Route 66, still following the tracks of the forgotten railroad that once fueled at this once thriving western outpost. The next one, we dive under the ground in Seattle, Washington, as we enter the subterranean city. Just after 2:15 p.m. on June 6, 1889, a cabinet maker in a Seattle woodworking shop was heating glue on a gasoline fire when it spilled, igniting the turpentine-soaked wood chips that covered the floor. Raging for more than 12 hours, the blaze leveled the city's wooden buildings. In the inferno's aftermath, residents rebuilt with brick, of course, on top of the ruins. The streets of the new settlement were regraded 2 stories above the original, and the subterranean space became known as the Seattle Underground. For a while, people continued using the old ground floors, which were now basements lit by skylights. Bathhouses where lumberjacks and prospectors could clean up were typical underground businesses. According to Dietrich Sachs, a guide for Beneath the Streets, which conduct tours in the area, outcast Chinese immigrants likely frequented underground gambling parlors, opium dens, and whorehouses, all of which were also common above ground. A fact not lost on an entrepreneurial German immigrant named Frederick Trump, grandfather of Donald Trump, who leased a restaurant that was also a brothel. In 1907, the threat of bubonic plague led officials to condemn the area, and over time the existence of the Seattle Underground became nothing but a legend until 1954, when Bill Speidel rediscovered the area while researching the city's past and began conducting underground tours. Unfortunately, the history of the fabled space will always remain incomplete. We all know there is more to the story, but sometimes the world just moves too fast. As we move on to the next one, as we take you back to the East Coast, as we dive into Centralia, Pennsylvania, as we take a look inside the burning mine. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Just before Memorial Day in 1962, firefighters in the coal mining town of Pennsylvania set fire to a landfill without knowing that it rested on the top of an old strip mining pit. Left to burn, the fire spread into abandoned underground mines and eventually beneath the town itself. Through a monumental series of blunders and inadequate attention over the years, it got to the size underground where it basically destroyed the town of Centralia, and everybody had to move. David DeCock, author of Fire Underground, told the Associated Press that by 1983, fissures in the ground were belching out lethal levels of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, spurring a relocation program that eventually left the town a maze of cracked streets, smoldering earth, abandoned houses, and an inspiration for the video game Silent Hill. Signs now warn curious visitors of dangers from asphyxiation and sinkholes, but that hasn't kept a handful of residents from remaining. In 2022, the town had a population of only 14. No one expects the fire to end anytime soon, but experts say the fuel will eventually run out in about 250 years. And the last and final one of the ghost towns, we take the trip all the way to Hashima Island in Japan as we enter the Forgotten Fortress. Known as the Midori Nashishima, Hashima is a 16-acre landmass off Japan's Nagasaki coast, now an abandoned ruin. It was for a time the most densely populated area in the world thanks to the discovery of subterranean coal beds in 1810. The Mitsubishi Corporation turned into a mining operation and built a network of concrete structures that housed up to 5,200 workers, giving the site of a forbidding fortress-like appearance and leading to yet another nickname, Battleship Island. By 1941, Hashima was producing 400,000 tons of coal a year, but when the fuel finally ran out in 1974, the island was abandoned to the typhoons of the surrounding sea. In 2009, after some of its structures were reinforced, Hashima reopened as a tourist destination. 6 years later, it became an UNESCO World Heritage Site, a controversial designation since so many of the miners on the island had been Korean laborers forced to work during Japan's colonial rule. During World War II, they were joined by captive Chinese. The common stories I heard was that they were enormously hungry, one expert told CNN. The meals were miserable, and when they could not go to work, they were tortured, punched, and kicked. More common deprivations prevailed too. There were no brushes, no flowers, no bushes. We didn't even know what the cherry blossom was, said one former resident. We told the seasons from one another by listening to the wind or looking at the color of the ocean and the sky. Over time, of course, nature had its way. The forlorn ruins of the island without green are now overrun without vegetation. Wow, that's a wild one. And guys, that's going to finish this topic off. Hope you guys enjoyed this one as we looked into some of the ghastly ghost towns from around the world. Now we're going to take a look and dive into some more historic places as we look into the horrifying hell gates. Starting off in Chengdu, China is the Ghost City. Let's enter. Overlooking the northern bank of China's Yangtze River, Ming Mountain is the unearthly home of Chengdu, the Ghost City. That was, according to legend, founded 2,000 years ago by two Eastern Han Dynasty officials, Yin Chanxing and Wang Fengping. Having fled the material world to devote themselves to Taoism, the men eventually became immortal, or so the story goes. After years of patient study, in fact, Yin Wang, their names combined, means King of Hell. During the Tang Dynasty, a temple depicting the horrors of hell was erected on the site, making it their spectral kingdom. Over time, the temple was joined by shrines representing the afterlife. 3 of which reflect the arduous test that some Chinese believe souls must face after death. The locations for the tests are Nothing to be Done Bridge, Ghost Torturing Pass, and Tianzi Palace. According to the effect, Chengdu is filled with sculptural depictions of ghosts and demons, many of which are clearly suffering the torments of hell. The most famous is the Ghost King, a giant face carved into the rock heel, the largest sculpture ever carved in rock. Sound like a Disneyland of death? Maybe. Consider that the city does indeed feature a theme park ride that gives tourists a first-hand glimpse of what it's like to go to Chinese hell. The next one, located, and this is a big one, as we really have to brave our souls to dive down deep into this one as we travel to England. As we enter the Hellfire Club, we dive into Satan's caves. Beginning in 1748, Sir Francis Dashwood, the 11th Baron Despencer, tried to help impoverished workers in West Wycombe, England, by paying them to construct a quarter-mile tunnel into the village's chalky hillside. But charity was wholly on Dashwood's mind when he asked his laborers to excavate secret chambers along the main tunnel, including a banquet hall constructed like a compass that contained niches for Italian statues. The tunnel terminated in the complex's so-called inner temple, which was reached only by crossing a subterranean stream the Dashwood dubbed Styx. After the river that leads to Hades in Greek mythology, located hundreds of feet below St. Lawrence's Church and Mausoleum. Also constructed by Dashwood, the temple served as the meeting place for a group known as the Hellfire Club. This notorious organization counted among its members such as 18th century British luminaries as the influential English painter William Hogarth, John Wilkes, a journalist and politician, and the Earl of Sandwich. The club's practice was rigorously pagan, according to novelist Horace Walpole. In fact, the members were suspected of practicing Satanism and sex rites in their twice-monthly meetings, during which they supposedly dressed as abbots and called the women who visited nuns. Though the club's predictably decadent dissolution is too complicated to convey here, suffice it to say that its only lasting legacy comes from the Earl of Sandwich, the putative inventor of the comestible that bears his name. Alright, the next one. Located in the Masaya volcano, the mouth of hell. When 16th century Spanish conquistadors arrived on the Pacific coast of what is now Nicaragua, I hope I said that right, they were terrified by the molten fury of the erupting Masaya volcano. Since few of them had seen a volcano before, at least of all an active one, they were easily influenced by the native belief that Masaya was a god. Indeed, indigenous tribes had routinely sacrificed children and virgins to the volcano on the pretext of sending them to fetch water. Aboriginal priests also climbed the crater to consult a divinatory deity who lived in the lava, an old woman. One conquistador wrote, with long and spiky hair, sharp fangs, and breasts reaching her waist. The legend sounded downright demonic to the Spaniards. Moreover, the volcano itself reflected the prevailing European belief that hell was located in the center of the earth, about 3,555 miles from human civilization to be exact. As a result, the conquistadors dubbed the volcano the mouth of hell, but in the end they came to the conclusion that Masaya was not. In fact, it was the entrance to the underworld. In 1615, Friar Juan de Torquemada, insisted that hell can't contain anything that causes joy. And since human souls aren't physical, he stated there's no need for hell to have mouths. Wow, that's a wild one. As we travel to the next one, located in Belize, we look at the Crystal Sepulchre. East of San Diego, Belize, after about an hour's drive and another hour on foot through the jungle, lies the Tapir Mountain Nature Reserve, the home of Unkatan Tanichi Munko, the ancient Mayan cave of the Crystal Sepulchre. Discovered in 1989, the 3-mile cavern is reputedly an entrance to the Mayan hell, otherwise known as a place of fear, a kingdom overseen by the underworld lords, Postmaster, Blood Gatherer, and Bone Scepter, among others. Here, among a subterranean stream, some 13 people, the youngest was just a year old, were ritualistically sacrificed by Mayan high priests at least 1,000 years ago. If the pottery, ritual objects, and pre-Columbian tools found at the site are any indication, they were probably killed between AD 700 and 900. The battered bones of these blunt trauma victims are uncannily preserved. None more strikingly than those of the so-called Crystal Maiden, the mineralized remains of an 18-year-old woman who has lain legs akimbo in the same spot for centuries. Though scholars aren't entirely sure why these innocents were slaughtered, they may have been sacrificed to the Mayan rain god Cha or to one of the aforementioned underworld lords. They don't call them Blood Gatherer and Bone Scepter for nothing. Whether it involved bludgeoning, decapitation, or the removal of a still beating heart from a living victim, human sacrifice was a way of life and death among the ancient Maya. And that's gonna do it for that's gonna do it. That was a wild list of places right there. Yeah, that was definitely horrifying, that's for sure. Some wild, creepy places in there too. But next, we're gonna take a look and dive into some of the world's creepiest abandoned places. I hope you're ready, because this is gonna be a good one. If you're ready, I'm ready. Let's dive in. Alright, starting off with number one on the abandoned places. We're going to travel to Germany to the Hillstatten Military Hospital, a desolate medical complex that's haunted by its Nazi and communist history. Let's go. Built in 1898 as a sanatorium to treat tuberculosis patients, the Hillstatten complex outside Berlin was converted for military use during World War I, when it received a young German soldier wounded in the thigh by a shell blast and temporarily blinded by mustard gas at the Battle of the Somme. Under the fine care there, Adolf Hitler would recover and go on to be awarded the Iron Cross on his way to infamy. The most famous figure shrouded in evil linked to this German hospital, though certainly not the last. Today, the sprawling 60-building complex outside of Berlin sits abandoned and forlorn, looking every bit as grim as the darkest chapters of its history. It's the very picture of death and despair which, in a strange way, has given it new life. Like many other parts of the world, Germany was ravaged by the incurable lung disease tuberculosis in the 19th century, when Kaiser William ordered the construction of the 600-bed facility in the woods, offering patients the only treatments available in the era before antibiotics, rudimentary and often fatal surgery, bed rest, and fresh air. By the early 1900s, the hospital has expanded to 1,200 beds and was surrounded by a village with bakers, butchers, a post office, a restaurant, and its own power station. When World War I broke out, the German Imperial Army converted sections of the sanatorium to a military hospital that would treat more than 1,700 soldiers, including the future Fuhrer. After serving as a tuberculosis treatment center again, the complex was returned to military service during World War II, when thousands more German troops retreated until the Soviet Red Army occupied the region and took over the complex in 1945. For the next half a century, the facility treated communist leaders as the largest hospital outside the USSR and continued to do so even after the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. A year before German reunification in 1990, a serial killer known as the Beast of Beaslitz terrorized the area, killing 5 women, including a mother and a baby, who were walking through the woods near the hospital where her Russian husband worked. The murderer, Wolfgang Schmidt, who often left pink lingerie draped on his victims' bodies, was captured in 1991 and sentenced to 15 years in prison and detention in a psychiatric hospital. The Soviets finally departed Belitz Hillstatt in 1994, turning the hospital over to Berlin officials, who ordered the old communist-themed murals on the hospital walls painted over and tried to keep the facility running. But financial problems forced its closure in 2000. Abandoned, it was engulfed by the forest, vines strangling the brick buildings and wide balconies where the tuberculosis patients once lay on beds in the hopes of the sunlight that will cure them. Inside the medical wards, the surgical tables and huge overhead lights were covered in rust. The paint peeled off the walls, and litter and debris covered the floors. Vandals sprayed graffiti on the wall, and looters took off with old medical equipment. Satanists were known to gather in young people through all-night parties. Soon the post-apocalyptic environment drew another crowd: curiosity seekers, artists, and photographers. Hollywood even took interest, using the grounds as a backdrop for the Roman Polanski's 2002 film Back the Pianist in the 2008 Tom Cruise movie Valkyrie. Today it's so popular that covered pathways were built for people to get close, but not too close, to the ruins. The next one, we're going to travel to Alaska, to the Kennecott Mine. We talked about this one earlier, but this one gives a little bit more history that we can dive into, so let's go. In the late 1990s, construction workers building government housing in a remote corner of Alaska, 300 miles east of Anchorage, started hearing strange sounds. Then they spotted strange shapes. Suddenly, tools they knew had been affixed to their belts disappeared. It was enough to frighten off even the boldest and bravest public servant. The Anchorage Daily News reported, and the whole project is said to have been canceled. The bizarre activity took place on an old railroad grade leading to Kennecott, a copper mining town established in the early 1900s. The mineral dug out of the cliffs that had turned green from oxidation and was more valuable than gold in those days, turning Kennecott into a boom town overnight. The copper ore was shipped down the mountain by rail for 200 miles to Prince William Sound, where it was carried by ships to smelters in Tacoma, Washington, financed by J.P. Morgan. The railroad was an engineering marvel, with the tracks having to be constantly adjusted because they were laid right on top of shifting glaciers. Untold numbers of workers died building the railroad, and many believe it was their painful cries and ghostly shenanigans that afflicted the modern-day construction crew. By the 1930s, after generating as much as $300 million worth of copper, the ore ran out and Kennecott quickly turned into a ghost town. The old red-painted wooden buildings, including a bunkhouse and hospital, may be battered but still remain standing. And Kennecott now draws hikers and tourists as a historical site, operated by the National Park Service. Some visitors claim to have seen tombstones on their way into the town, but the grave markers appear to have vanished when they pass again on the way out. Now we're going to travel over to Montana to see Garnet. Although this Montana town was named after the semi-precious ruby stone first mined in the area, the real riches came from gold. A strike in the 1890s turned a ragtag mining camp into a booming town with about 1,000 residents, 4 hotels, 2 barber shops, a mercantile shop, a butcher, and 13 saloons. Like many prosperous mining communities, Garnet had its share of gambling and prostitution, but for the most part kept the vices in check, or at least away from the respectable folk who held picnics, dances, and fishing trips. The jail held mostly men who needed to sleep off a night of heavy drinking. After about 20 years, the gold dwindled, chasing away the mining companies, and World War I emptied the town of the rest of the able-bodied men. By the early 1900s, only a few dozen people were left. Aside from a brief boost from a rise in gold prices in the 1930s, Garnet has been all but abandoned. Today it stands as one of the most well-preserved ghost towns in the West, attracting tens of thousands of tourists during the summer months, but leaving the town to its phantom inhabitants in the brutal Montana winters. Local legend has it that the spirits seem to prefer the solitude of the cold seasons when the roads are closed, and as Ellen Baumler of the Montana Historical Society says, the spirits dance to ghostly music. Anyone who visits the deserted town in the dead of winter should be prepared to meet them, she says. They hide in the shadows, laugh in the wind, and come out when you least expect them. For those who manage to venture into the town by skis or snowmobile, they may spot the mysterious woman gazing out of an upstairs room of the JK Hotel that hasn't seen a guest in decades. In Kelly's saloon nearby, a piano plays on its own, and outside some buildings, footsteps in the snow lead to the front doors, but none are seen leaving. The next one is another one we've already talked about, but it does give some more history, so we're going to dive right back into it as we take a trip back to Japan to revisit the Hashima Island. 9 miles off the shore of Nagasaki, Japan, looms Hashima Island, a concrete jungle of crumbling, desolate buildings that once made up one of the most densely populated spots on Earth. 5,259 people on just 18 acres, all there for one reason, digging coal. Long owned by Mitsubishi, Hashima Island, nicknamed Battleship Island for its warship shape, was a mining town that supplied fuel to Japan for a century. During its long, dark history, Hashima used Chinese and Korean prisoners of war to mine the coal. The laborers endured heat, humidity, beatings, and starvation rations from 1925 to 1945, as an estimated 123 Koreans and 15 Chinese workers died on the island. As petroleum replaced coal as a fuel, the island was deserted in the 1970s, and the many buildings were left to decay. These earliest of Japan's skyscrapers have been reduced to heaps in many places, balconies collapsing, concrete chunks falling, in a haunting example of industrial ruin that draws intrepid visitors today. As the very picture of an arch villain's hideout, Hashima Island attracted the interest of the producers of the 2012 James Bond installment Skyfall, who wanted to use this hellscape as their lair for 007's nemesis Silva, played by Javier Bardem. But after scouting the location, producers decided it was too dangerous and instead filmed on duplicate sets on a soundstage, although the island does appear in a few exterior shots. The next one, we're going to take a trip to Italy to visit Craco. Perched atop the 13,000-foot cliff overlooking the Cavone River Valley, this ancient fortress town survived invasion, plunderers, plague, political upheaval, a famous gangster, and famine, everything but landslides. Archaeologists determine that people have inhabited this hill near the sole of Italy's boot since the 8th century BC, and likely long before that. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords controlled Craco, drawn to its prime defensive location, constructing the castle that now looms atop the cliff. As well as university, 4 large palazzi were added in the 15th century, with a population reaching more than 2,500. Craco was hit by a series of upheavals. The plague in 1656 killed hundreds and sent many others fleeing at the end of the 1700s. The town overthrew the Bourbon feudal powers only to see the Bourbons return. Then it fell to Napoleonic forces while Bourbon brigands periodically returned to kill and plunder. More strife engulfed Craco during the battles for Italy's unification in the 1800s. For a time, folk hero gangster Carmine Crocker ruled the town. But Mother Nature posed the biggest and ultimately fatal threat. Years of bad harvests sent more than 1,000 starving townspeople to North America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Then, starting in the early 1960s, a series of landslides triggered by erosion, earthquakes, and bad underground piping forced the remaining residents to evacuate, leaving Craco abandoned. Today, Craco's ruins stand proudly atop the hill, though access to the dangerously crumbling structures is cut off by fences and gates. People are only allowed back to Craco during religious festivals for the Virgin Mary and the town's patron saint, San Vincenzo. The next one is Al-Jawariya Al-Hamra. The town is frozen in time, as if one minute they were driving for pearls and the next racing out of their homes. The town stands as one of the best examples of what the United Arab Emirates looked like before the oil industry changed everything. Why everyone left 50 years ago remains a mystery, and today only the ancient spirits inhabit the abandoned town. Located on the Persian Gulf, 145 miles north of the capital city of Abu Dhabi, this ghost town was a maritime community with a population of more than 2,000 people living in housing complexes built from coral and beach stones with roofs of woven date palms. Since the early 1800s, pearl fishing drove the local economy. The town had a fleet of about 24 pearl diving boats, and trading thrived. Then in the late 1960s, hundreds of families packed up their belongings and left, while many other small old villages were also abandoned as a steady flow of oil money modernized the Gulf states. The ghost town escaped redevelopment and the wrecking ball. The town had remained virtually untouched. As archaeologist Christian Vade said, it is an interesting reflection of how all these towns and now cities in the UAE and beyond once looked. Debate swirls around why the town was deserted. Some villagers say that they sought better lives with new homes and modern public works in Abu Dhabi after the UAE was created in 1971. Others suggest it was caused by a dispute, the causes of which have been lost to history between the town's majority at Al-Zab tribe and the nearby rulers. Today, the town is described as a haunting ghost town or ghost city, haunted by spirits called jinns lurking in the ruins, making strange noises at night. The setting is so spooky that horror movies have been shot in the old town, but preservationists scoff at the ghost stories, saying that the site should be preserved as a living museum to the Gulf's region's history. The next one is one that we are all familiar with, and a sad, sad story on how this became abandoned. Let's take a trip to New Orleans, Louisiana, as we visit Six Flags New Orleans. Is there any place sadder than the abandoned amusement park? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, Six Flags Park was submerged under up to 7 feet of water, which toppled concession stands and mud pouring into food stalls and wrecked the machinery of 80% of the rides. When water finally receded after a month, this former fun zone, locally known by its original name as Jazzland, when it opened in 2000, had become a hellscape of broken windows, rusted railings, soiled clowns, and cracked Mardi Gras figures. Only a Batman-themed roller coaster survived, thanks to it being built on an elevated platform. Locks soon went up on the gates in a failed effort to keep out pesky vandals and curious onlookers. Graffiti now covers every surface, even the bumper cars. The park has sat for more than 15 years as the city grapples with what to do with it. With the surviving roller coaster shipped to another park, officials have considered resurrecting Six Flags as another theme park, though nothing has come of it. Some have suggested building an outlet mall on the 160-acre site, but that too hasn't happened. Just tearing everything down and selling it for scraps has proved to be prohibitively expensive. For now, the only people interested in the park are Hollywood producers who have used it as a backdrop for the Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and Killer Joe. But the city keeps seeking a solution. In December of 2020, New Orleans put out bids for a developer in what was hoped to be a final push. 4 months later, a group including retired Saints quarterback Drew Brees was among 3 contenders who submitted proposals for the site. As we travel to the next one, as we travel a little bit up north to Washington, D.C., as we visit St. Elizabeth's Hospital. It looks like a set from a horror movie. Hypodermic needles and slides smeared with brain tissue litter the autopsy lab. In the surgical ward, a blood-stained operating table is covered in rust. Paint peels from the walls and debris litters the floor. Welcome to the birthplace of lobotomy. In Blackburn Lab, neuropathologist Walter Freeman lobotomized some 3,500 patients in the 1950s and 1960s, including John F. Kennedy's sister Rosemary. Over one 12-day period, he operated on 228 people, charging $20 apiece. Opened in 1855 as a government hospital for the insane, St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the U.S. Capitol was once one of the leading institutions for the treatment of mental illness. Its reputation for science and innovation clouded by dark episodes from its history. In the 1940s, the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's forerunner, partnered with the hospital on experiments with truth serum to get prisoners of war to talk. After trying various drugs, researchers settled on marijuana. After smoking THC-laced cigarettes, the subject's thoughts flow with considerable freedom. A report found, and conversation became animated and accelerated, but in the end, the plan was deemed probably not adaptable for mass interrogation. The hospital cared for one presidential assassin and 2 would-be presidential murderers. Charles J. Guttural, after he killed James Garfield in 1881, Richard Lawrence, who attempted to kill Andrew Jackson in 1835, and John Hinckley Jr., who shot Ronald Reagan in 1981. But St. Elizabeth's was best known for Dr. Freeman's lobotomies until the practice fell out of favor with the advent of antipsychotic drugs. After Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967, the hospital declined. as large-scale institutions gave way to outpatient services and ultimately the hospital closed. Federal officers and officials are now seeking a use for the old medical wards. And that's going to do it for the top abandoned places in the world. Well, guys, that was a good set of abandoned places. Some of them creepy, some of them a lot of dark history behind them. And then some of them just nature took over and unfortunately didn't give it back. But that's going to do it for tonight's episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. As always, like and subscribe. And I'm going to sign on out of here. And we'll see you guys on the next adventure. It's a dark world after all. It's a dark world after all. It's a dark world after all. It's a dark, dark world. Of shadows creeping down the hall, whispers echo off the walls. Every corner hides a fall in this dark, dark world.